All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. I have the great pleasure of introducing our special guest speaker today, Professor Konrad Korning. So Dr. Konrad Korning is currently the Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Prior to his tenure there, he was a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago for 10 years in the Department of Physiology. So Konrad actually started off receiving his PhD in physics at ETH Zurich, and then he went on to do postdocs in computational and cognitive neuroscience with people like Daniel Wolpert and Joshua Tenenbaum. So it was around this time that I think he started writing a very influential series of papers in the field of motor control. One of his primary innovations was learning to apply Bayesian theories to modeling how the brain controls voluntary movement, as well as adapts motor skills. More recently, Konrad's lab has been using data science and machine learning methods towards a wide range of applications. I think that's going to be the theme of the talk today. So outside of his research activities, Konrad has been at the forefront of open education as well. For a number of years, he ran the Computational Sensory Motor Neuroscience Summer School. That's where I got to see him in action at first. And then more recently, he co-founded the NeuroMatch Academy, which is a massive online summer school in computational neuroscience, which provides free world-class education to, at this point, thousands of students worldwide. So just one last bit, he's probably most famous among my students at this point for co-authoring the first great textbook on Bayesian modeling of perception and action. We refer to it as the Bible. And so this is all just to say, he's a very busy man, and we're very happy to have him here today.
Thanks so much for having me here. I want to tell you about liberating movement science from the laboratory. I think it's really important. So when I started as a movement scientist, kind of movement science was almost by definition something you did in the lab, in particular in my subpart of the field. No, there existed always sports scientists, and they were interested in like golf swings and real things like that. But by and large, in computational motor control, everything was about you bring people into the lab and you have them move your hand, and then you give them some feedback on the screen, and then you see how they keep moving, and then you like rotate what you show a little bit, like visual motor rotations, or alternatively, if you're rich, you buy a big robot, like I move my hand forward, the robot pushes me to the left. You're going to see what happens, and then we're going to fit optimal control or Bayesian models and all that. And I think that was an important development because that field, computational motor control, really pushed to find computational mathematical ways of describing how movement happened. And I think that was very important. But I think where the field failed at some level is bringing movement science into reality. And therefore the field really regrettably split into two parts. There were people studying real things, swimming, diving, climbing, you name it. And other people who used math to describe how people move their hand on the surface. And that ultimately was a sad state of affairs, because I think us computational folks always had so much to learn from people who were studying real movements. And at the same time, if I dare say it, people who were studying real world movement could have benefited a lot from the computational techniques that community was pioneering. Now, the big problem was even that computational community didn't have the tools to describe real complex behavior, like Konrad, gesticulating with his arms. We just didn't have the tools. And I think that is changing. And so today I want to talk a little bit about traditional style computational motor control, but how we can remove it out of the lab. And I think this is going to be a major theme for the next 10 years or so, where we will ask similar questions that can produce good models, but we will ask them in a way that we can bring into the real world, right? That we can bring into actual movements that people make, as opposed to these simplified movements that we have. So here's the kind of movements that I guess I'm still known in some circles for. We have movements, and then we do a perturbation. And then we ask what happens with that perturbation. And there's cases that are of the integration kind. I move, you give me some feedback, I've got to get it to a target, and I take into account the information that I have there. There's other cases that are about learning. Like you move, I lie to you and pretend you made a mistake, and I see what you do in the next trial. And we did a lot of those experiments. So here's like maybe the most well-known experiment. It's an experiment with Daniel Warpert. We gave uncertain feedback, and we varied the level of uncertainty of that. So we had a condition where there was very little uncertainty. And if you have very little uncertainty, you will mostly rely on the things that you see. That's what we have at sigma 0. It's a measure of error that we have on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have how much perturbation there is in a given trial. And small error means we rely on what we see. Large error means we rely on what we expect. And indeed, what we found is like, if we make it that you're basically blind or almost blind, you rely a lot on what you expect. And if we make your vision really good, you rely a lot on what you see and much less on what you expect. And if we zoom out from that way of thinking, now this is an example of so-called normative thinking. In normative thinking, you say there is a problem that the brain needs to solve. In this case, we only get limited amounts of data from the world, and we still need to make estimates. And we know things about the world, and then we can take the things that we know and combine them with the things that we see to kind of make good estimates. And the logic of that, if we zoom out, is there's this problem that we need to solve. We know what the optimal solution looks like. Now, Bayesian statistics is the math that solves that. To which level do people do things similarly to what they should be doing? No? And like, if we find that they're similar, then we can conclude that, like, yeah, the brain kind of like through evolution and learning, and we don't know which of the two of them it is, that the brain kind of does its right thing. And that's in a way like the strength of that approach. You know, like you figure out things about the world. We know a lot about the world. You figure out what the best solution to that is. You compare it to reality. And so the strength is that you can make these predictions. Those are models. They have no free parameters. It's just like, I know what you should be doing, and I'm going to test what if you're doing it like that. And yes, we wrote a lot of papers as a field, and people generally do the right thing. It just isn't the real world. And so then the question is if we can bring it to the world. Now, like, what are the pros and cons? If we have these simple things, like it's great, it's easy to model. Makes my life as a modeler much, much easier. It's easy to run the experiment, no? Because all I do is I bring people in and like they do 10,000 trials on like moving their hand on the surface. It's easy to do data analysis. It's hard to do wrongly. Like there's very relatively few failure modes. But of course, it's generally small data because I need to bring in people into the lab. I can't like rely on some big data set that has everything. It's low external validity. Like how much do the things that I find in the lab like actually matter in your reality? Well, actually kind of no one knows, which is a little bit sad. It doesn't really scale to very large numbers. And there's also the curse of small models. And I'll talk a little more about the curse of small models. But basically, if you have small models, small data, you force yourself into a space of very simplistic behaviors. And I think we can get out of that. So let me talk about a first project. We call it baseball. I've done these experiments. I guess I'm still known for a lot of those experiments where I looked at do people do Bayesian things when they're in the lab? But do they do it in sports as well? So what is it that we get out of the lab experiment? So the first thing is, if I ask you to combine two things, and they're both sufficiently uncertain that we can model them as Gaussian, then we should have that the best estimate is that as I vary one of them, there should be a linear effect on my estimate at the end. So that's the first thing, linear dependence on error. Then we should have weak priors on uncommon or unpredictable things. And lastly, we should have like stronger priors when we know what will be happening. And it turns out that in professional baseball, we will be able to ask those questions. But first, let's talk about baseball. Now, in most rooms where I talk, I'm the single person who knows least about baseball. But given that there's enough people in this room, there will be a few people that are almost as clueless as I'm about it. So the first defining case there is how unbelievably fast it is. So the ball flies about 60 feet. It takes the ball less than half a second for that period of time. So half a second is like off the order of like, what are reaction times of the brain? Like the very fastest are like in the 100, 150 millisecond range. But if you want to do a more complex thing, that's going to take you much longer. So what's happening? The pitcher takes the ball and tries to hide what they will do. So they do their utmost that you have no idea what's going to happen in the movement. And in fact, if they screw things up, then the other player will figure out what they're going to be doing. And I will later on in the talk about what happens in that case. And what do you expect? Well, if they screw up that thing and you know what's going to happen, you will be better at doing your stunts in a very peculiar way. And then they wind up, they start throwing the ball. And at that point of time, the observer can see what the ball is really doing. Like there we switch from something that tells us what the ball likely will do, which the pitcher is trying its best to hide from you, to something where you actually get the information for how the ball is actually flying. You can say, while the ball flies, I'm obtaining some likelihood function. I'm going to explain an estimate of how the ball actually flies in this point of time. I have a prior that I get from before. Now you can say, and this is all like in the real world as opposed to the lab. What's the prior and what's the likelihood? It's kind of like a little hard to say where does one end and where the other one starts. Operationally, the way we think about it is kind of like what happens until the ball is released is the things that set up our prior beliefs. Anything happening afterwards is the likelihood function. And the better perceives it, the better now decides where to, at which height to throw to hit the ball. And in the end, the batter does do its throw. And the batter basically estimates how high the ball will be and like swings at that level of where they think the ball is. It's well defined where the ball has to be. It has to be between the knees and the chest, otherwise it doesn't count. And within that region, there's going to be some probability distribution. And here you see how the probability distribution looks like. Why, by the way, why are we doing this on baseball? Because like the baseball freaks are just like so into the statistics of this thing that literally everything anyone in baseball ever does has been digitized. So we're talking about like millions of pitches here. So all our distributions will be nice and like p-values will all be exactly 0 for all practical purposes. So that already is much nicer than if I did it in the lab because it would have taken me a long time to do that. Although this paper, writing it took a really long time. So we're going to have a Gaussian distribution where you can see sometimes the pitcher is outside of range. Now, like the knees to chest is the box where they wanted to place it. But they can't avoid uncertainty either. So they will sometimes kind of be out of the range where they want to be. And that's the probability distribution. Now you can say, if I'm the pitcher trying to estimate how the ball will land, I know that this is going to be the distribution. I kind of expect that usually it's kind of going to be close to the middle of that and sometimes to the side and like sometimes outside of it. And in fact, if I'm pretty sure it's outside of it, I'm best of not hitting it. And now, in the lab experiments, what are the things that we want to know? We want to know what's the probability distribution that we give to our people for the estimation. What's the prior probability distribution? We want to know what's the likelihood function. And we also want to know what's the estimate that they will have. And so we need something where we can say, what did that baseball batter think where the ball will land? So how can we do that? Well, it turns out that like they have a certain ideal launch angle. They would like the ball to go up at 25 degrees on average. And so they want to hit just slightly under the ball, and relative to that 25 degrees, if they misestimate and they're too low at their estimate, the ball will go up higher. If they misestimate and they're further up, the ball will go further down. So if you tell me the direction in which the ball jumps off from the bat, I have an estimate of what they estimated at that point of time. So now I have all the things that I have in my experiments in professional batters. Like I have what the estimate is, I have what the perturbation is, namely where the ball actually goes into it. And then we can say, do similar things that happen in the lab now happen in sports. And here we see the first thing, the linear response to perturbation. On the y-axis here, you have where the ball ended up. Not like we have the knees to chest axis. We also have bins for what happens if things are outside of it. If people would only look at the ball, if they had no priors, then on average, the ball should run up at the same angle, regardless of where it is within the box. This is what we would have here in that. Oh, can I have the cursor there? Yes, I can. Look, that's this gray line here. If they would only use what they see. If they would only use what they believe where the ball would be, which would be just the middle of the box, we would get something that is much more like the blue line that we sketched here. What we get in reality is something that is linear dependency and that is meaningfully between those two extreme cases. So yes, so this is the first thing. So like there's some evidence that they use what they believe with what they see from the ball and combine that. And that's exactly shown, like if the ball comes low, they hit it high relative to the ball. If the ball comes high, they hit it low relative to that. And like a lot of Bayesian things, a lot of these are like very intuitive. It's an intuitive way that we can meaningfully test. And I should say, if we look at the slope and the bias here across a couple of different balls, fastballs, sliders, sinkers, and so forth, they all like look relatively similar this way. Now you could say, are there cases where their priors should be particularly bad? And there's two known cases. The first one is the knuckleball. The knuckleball is thrown in such a way that it doesn't rotate. And because it doesn't rotate, like there's no predicting it. Now, like if you have a fastball, you're going to get a distribution. In fact, I should have plotted that as well. Every ball has kind of its own distribution. And the way the ball's distinguished in the way like the ball rotates and the way it's thrown and how fast it's thrown. But if we have knuckleballs, it's unpredictable to know where it is because if it doesn't rotate, it's kind of pretty random how the ball moves sideways. And then there's the ethos, which is kind of like a pitch that is so rare that most pitchers like just almost never experience it. And what would we expect in those cases? Your prior knowledge will be really, really bad. So you will instead like assume, well, it could be like pretty much anywhere within the box. And what that means in standard Bayesian modeling is you should rely a lot on what you see in those cases, not because you don't have any strong prior knowledge that you have there. And this is exactly what we find here. So you see at the top, the fits for the knuckleball and the ethos, you can see it's pretty much flat. It means that they don't systematically underhit if it's high and overhit if it's low. No, they're always like pretty much unbiased. And the reason why they will always be unbiased is they don't know what they should be expecting here. And you can see that quantified at the bottom. At the bottom, you have the various pitches. And indeed, there's two pitches where we expect most uncertainty. Knuckleball, because it's very unpredictable, and ethos, because like no one knows how to predict it because it happens so rarely. They have weights that are very, very low. It means they rely on what they see. They have no strong preconceived notion how it will come in. So that's the one thing, like they're the things that make like the priors uncertain. But there's other things that make the priors more certain, which is pitch tipping. So if my body as a pitcher gives away how I will throw, then you can predict that as a batter, and it's really bad for me. So they try really, really hard to always move in exactly the same way, regardless of what they do. But like as they're human beings, sometimes people screw up. And it is known that certain pitchers over some periods of their time do something that gives away what they do. There's like rumors that Boris Becker was moving the tongue into the direction of where he was going to put the ball. In this specific case, it's the way they hold their hands. And for me, those two photographs look more or less the same. But apparently, it's so obvious that if you know that that guy taps like that like everyone in the opposing team would always know about it. And then you could say, what's the result? Well, we have a much better prior. We know this will be a fastball. Because it's a fastball, it's going to have a more narrow distribution on a given trial. And this is exactly what we find here, where you can say the slope now gets much larger. People rely very much on the prior. Which means that like if it's high, they will like underhit it more than normally. If it's low, they will overhit it more than normally. It's like they very much know how they'll be moving regardless of how it's being thrown. And you can see that this is also these tipping situations. And we basically just looked at the literature, find situations where tipping happened and where people publicly wrote, yeah, I knew in that period of time that this person was giving away which ball it was. And indeed, what we find is you see in red, where we are in the tipping cases, in those tipping cases, much, much more reliance on what you should be expecting. So, summary of the baseball findings here. Like the key things that we looked for in laboratory results, now we can bring to the real sport. Linear response, the prayer can be made better by tipping. The prayer can be made worse by things where you don't have strong prayers like ethos and knuckleball. And we can predict how the behavior should change in response to those. Now, this is a study that we started a few years ago. In fact, Justin Brantley, who ran that, joined the Texas Rangers as a data scientist, and they won like this big competition that as a German, I don't really even know, but like within a few months of him joining the team. So it seems to be helping. But this is just an example of how we can bring studies more into the real world. And of course, it's what's opening the floodgates now is video to post. So we are having progressively good algorithms that take as input a video and produce as output a full skeletal tracking of how someone moves. And of course, a lot of you will have heard about the packages for post tracking, like OpenPose. Is a historical one, maybe Deep Lab Cat, super popular in experimental labs working with animals. Sleep, Thea Markerless is a commercial solution in that space. But in any case, we no longer need motion tracking hardware. And that, of course, massively changes the availability of data. Now, like if you had to like hook someone up to sensors, bring them into a lab, you'd be very limited at the number of subjects you can run. Whereas if you can just go anywhere you have a video camera, anywhere you have a phone for that matter, you know exactly what how someone moves their body, then like basically movement labs are everywhere. Like every camera is like in a way a movement lab. And I think this is very quickly the direction where we're going. And I think this will change everything that we do. And so what's the approach? I will talk just about an example that we did a few years ago. I'll also talk about this example because I think it has a very interesting property that I want to share with you in a few minutes. We thought that wouldn't it be cool if we would know if a baby develops normally by just taking a video of it? And the idea is very attractive. Like it's known that if you tell me that a baby is not developing normally, I can give them early PT and they will develop much better. So developing that early is very, very valuable. And there's plenty of videos of babies. The world is in fact full of like people obsessed of taking like videos with their babies. They're also obsessed about like worrying. I mean, I have 3 kids. You worry about like if your babies are developing normally, and of course, like they're like late by a few weeks on some skill, and then like the next day they pick it up. In any case, so what did we do there? We took a database, and in that first study, we knew that we had far too few subjects. So if you want to do pretty much any study, you need hundreds of subjects. There was no way when we get into that field that we would get hundreds of subjects from the get-go. So what we did instead is we did the next best thing. We pre-registered the study. We said we will recruit a tiny number of people, but this is at least exactly what we're going to do with them. And what we did is we had a database of what we call normative infant movements. What that means is we took random videos of YouTube of infants, and we said, like, yeah, like the probability that they develop abnormally is very low. Like, no, the vast majority of babies develop just fine. Thank you very much. And then we get a database of movement from a clinical setting where we knew that the probability of them having problems was much, much elevated relative to that. And then we can compare the two of them to do an assessment of risk. We can basically say, how similar is this baby to like the babies from YouTube, of which we have good reasons to assume that they're all like developing like pretty fine. And therefore we can do comparisons. So here's an example. We take infant movements from YouTube and we do YouTube searches such as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months old baby or so-and-so many weeks old. Inclusion criteria, infants not occluded, infants move independently, infant body is present in the video within the frame, duration greater 6 seconds, simple algorithm, 385 videos found using the search and 85 included after manual review for quality. And so we don't have like any way of specifically looking for things. And then we get data from a clinical setting, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, approved by the ethics board, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be telling you about it. Inclusion criteria, infants cannot yet walk, absence of history of cardiac, neurological, and orthopedic condition, and parents, of course, performed informed context. GoPro camera used to record movements, Bailey Infant Neurodevelopment Screener, BINS was used to clinically assess neuromotor risks. Some of them are low risk, moderate risk, high risk. Now, look at those numbers. The numbers are just hideously low. Now, why do we have this small number? Because we knew we couldn't get more out of that setting at that point of time. It was an unfunded effort. It sounded like a really good idea. And we just said, well, let's just look at the videos that we have and ask, are they similar to the healthy subjects or are they not? It turns out that this kind of surprise calculation requires, in theory, very low numbers of subjects. Then we extracted posts from it, open posts. This paper, we did this like about 3-4 years ago. It's amazing how post tracking is much better now. Like the post tracking that we had back then was really surprisingly bad. I mean, you could track them meaningfully, but basically you'd always be off by a few centimeters. And it's amazing how like modern post tracking is basically, this problem is basically among the set of solved problems. On the computer science side, I don't think it has like fully made its way into and this is single camera post tracking, like just a video and you construct the movement based on that. Messy estimates, and like open post is trained on adults. And then we, of course, did what everyone does if they have a small data set. You take a data set that's trained on something similar. Here, OpenPost trained mostly on adults, and then we fine-tuned it. We basically retuned it to reproduce our own labeled infant video data set. And yes, it meant like a scientist basically clicking on a lot of hands to get training data for that. And then and like what people use is they use the big difference is like babies have different body configuration as adults, and they of course will have different statistics of movements, and ultimately any of these models implicitly uses knowledge of that. So that's why it's important to fine tune. By the way, anyone working with patients, you can almost never use off the shelf like post tracking results, because basically they all will build in the way people normally look and the way people normally move. So have like a particular old group of people, you need to retrain babies, need to retrain people with motor disease, you need to retrain. It's just like an unfortunate fact of that thing. Okay, but in any case, we do domain adaptation. We labeled 9,000 key points using Batik. We took about 1/8 of the data set, declared a training test set, and use that for training 75 iterations. In any case, you can see kind of like through retraining on that, you get good at predicting, at post-tracking babies that you haven't seen before. And you can see that the root mean squared error goes down like almost by a factor of 3. So it like really makes a big difference. And here you can see, I believe this is my own son. That was a long time ago. In any case, you can see that we have working baby training. Now and then, of course, you need to clean up the data, removing outliers, you do some smoothing, you have a fixed reference system for the babies and so on and so forth. You make them all be the same size because you don't want to learn about their age, you want to like learn about like how they actually move. And then you do what's called old-fashioned feature engineering. Basically, how does that work? You sit down with a couple of MDs. You're like, so you say you can look at babies and tell me if they're healthy or not. Tell me how you know. And they're like, yeah, you know, like the babies, they like the not well developing babies, they they're like jerky. And you're like, well, would jerky be sometimes very fast movements, usually not much? And they're like, yeah, that's kind of right. But like also, and they kind of like, you try and put the things they explain to you into a set of equations. In this case, we used 52 of them: mean position, IQR, median, speed, acceleration, entropy, left-right cross correlation, symmetry, like kind of like features like that. 52 of them. Now, what we wanted is we wanted a way of analyzing the data that really works for low N. I told you we have 19 subjects, like better work on very small. And what we did is we used naive Bayesian surprise. We basically said, let's assume we have these 54 features. We have some distribution of all the features. And of course, if you're an outlier on one feature, that is suspicious. And if you're an outlier on lots of features, that's more suspicious than if you're an outlier on one of them. So we basically calculate for all of them how much of an outlier it is. And we then added up all of that. So more specifically, it's basically we have Gaussian models along each feature, and we just add the log probability of all of them together. And Bayesian surprise is kind of known to be one of these data analyses. So the first cool thing is, no, it requires only a lot of data from healthy subjects. I'm not trying to distinguish the healthy from the sick babies. I'm trying to take the healthy babies, and I'm like, yeah, healthy babies are 90% of the time symmetrical or something. Then you can say, well, like if you're based on that, I can say, for even if I had only a single baby, I could say, oh, that baby is ideally suspicious. Like everyone is like almost always symmetrical, that baby is not. And so you can, in that surprise space, really do things that are meaningful with a very small number of subjects. And this is what we found. YouTube. Here we have the YouTube babies, okay, on average, like zero surprise. The low risk babies look very similar. Medium risk kind of look more different. And the high risk babies a lot more different, and that all is very significant. And it was fully pre-registered. So before looking at any of the babies, you like uploaded this is the exact data analysis plan that we're going to use. And yep, worked, got accepted. And of course, I thought this was pretty cool because like, hey, if we could like actually use a video to tell if a baby is developing normally, it's something that like a lot of parents would be very much interested in. And it could be used in like low resource settings. So it's like a super attractive like research program. What's not published yet is we now then try to replicate that with like 1,000 videos of 1,000 like babies, like much better power, much bigger. And it doesn't generalize. So basically, yes, the first study was pre-registered, but it was still small. And if you have small studies, even if you're pre-registered, even if you're very significant, you might find that if you then replicate it, it doesn't replicate. And it could also be that there's just difference. No two samples of patients are drawn from the very same distribution. But like, it's just like so shocking. Like it's pre-registered. I was like, sure, like it must be right. And then it didn't replicate. And I think now what we're trying to do now is like go much more in the big data. And like, what if we, and it turns out that there's just a lot of aspects of babies that aren't in there. And like healthy babies respond to you. Like you look at them and they like kind of see that you're there. And like these reactions, well, it's all missing in the data. So we feel that we must be, no, and we're in this weird space. Like we're like by movement science standards on like 1,000 patients. It's like pretty good. And yet the doctors, like it's kind of known that they can diagnose babies by just looking at them. So why can't we? Because we have the same data. Well, we don't have the same data. Like, for example, like the rest of the environment is missing and like the data analysis algorithm can't interact with them. So we're following up now, like seeing if we can just improve the machine learning to better understand that. Now, I want to briefly zoom out. I should have done that earlier, but I just wanted you to see how good post-tracking is. So here you see post-tracking over time. And on the y-axis, you basically have a measure of how precise post-tracking is. So this is from Papers with Code. People who don't know that, there's this amazing web page that like lists all the deep learning programs and like lists all the data sets and how good they are over time. It's really amazing. And you can see how over time it really dramatically improved. And now the modern post-tracking algorithms don't seem much worse than like I do it with my eyes anymore. So that's one thing, like we can get the poses out of it. And I think we can bring a lot of the older approaches where we were forced into small feature sets into like the real world. And it's much, our data process was much cheaper. And like, why? Because all we needed is like a camera. Like if I had to bring in 1,000 babies into a lab and like have them evaluated, now that would have been really expensive. Whereas there was like, there is a data sources where videos are already taken of the babies. There are electronic health records that already say how the babies are developing, and then there's parents that come through and like sign your permission thing. Okay, cool. Post tracking is working. I wanted to briefly zoom out here and talk about foundation models. So we all experiment with ChatGPT. In fact, like who has used ChatGPT in like a large language model in the last week? Okay, nice. So I find that it like dramatically makes me better at solving simple coding tasks fast. You know, like load the data, show me the outliers, fit the simple model to it, do some basic machine learning. Like it's like it really, really makes things much faster. Why do they work so well? Why they work so well? Because they've basically been trained on like anything that humans have ever said and all the coding problems that exist like basically on the internet and public places and private places. So, which is weird, no? Like it's not that when it comes to doing machine learning that is only trained on machine learning. It's trained on everything. Now, why does that help? It's kind of weird, no? The reason why it helps is because there are patterns in code, and those patterns of code go well beyond machine learning. You know, once you understand the logic of coding, machine learning is like really quite easy. And so you always have these, that kind of this whole context that you have is like really, really super relevant. And these kinds of approaches will now very quickly come to movement science. Now we will have in the next 5 years, the latest, big models trained on millions of hours of human movement. And these will be models powerful enough that we can kind of do research on them, that we can plug into our research to get things better. So the thing that happened to ChatGPT or like to large language models in the text domain is going to happen in the movement space for pretty much everything that we do. And we want like good movement models that we can use to have models of movement. And I should briefly talk here about like some joint work with the Michael Platt lab. I should say the baby studies were all done together with Michelle Johnson. And I think I forgot to like have the references on it. It's a new deck that I just made just to be talking with you about it. Foundation models, like the idea is don't train on one problem, train on all of the domain. Like you want models that are not trained on whatever the thing is that you study. You want models that are trained on all of human movement. And then you want to make them good in the specific thing that you study. And in general, when we follow this strategy, you will find that the errors that your machine learning model makes or something will go down by a factor of 2 or something. It's like really massive. It's like it has an effect size that we haven't seen before. Neuroscience Eva Dyer just came out with like a wonderful program called POYO. You basically train on all spike data you can get your hand on. And you do much better than if you train on any one thing, which is weird, no? Because like every neuron is different. In the same way that at some level, like every sport is different, but like the sports share the same body. Neurons in the brains share like the same thought patterns at some level. So just like in text, it really helps to like train on everything that's around it. And like we used to train on one domain, maybe translation. In fact, there were professors whose only content of their research was, I do translation models. And natural language processing is the first field that I know of that basically shut down. Why did NLP shut? No, they're all doing good because they were among the first to like embrace those techniques. But why did it shut down? Because basically building really, really big models based on everything ended up being better at all the local problems than what we'd have otherwise. And it's quite possible that movements like that will happen to movement science as well. And it's really weird, the influence that it has. And like the professors that did translation, like their code is worthless, like entirely worthless. Like it's kind of, you're much better, like take like ChatGPT and like just fine tune it on a translation task. And so fields can go through these very sudden transitions. So I'm very much committed to building foundation models for movement. Anyone interested in big foundation models for movement, I'd love to talk. We've been doing some of that research on monkeys, and we also work on some of these on babies. I will just tell you some work on monkeys. Here's work from Philippe Parodi, who's shared between me and Michael Platt. Macaque pose, Open Monkey Challenge, and Open Ape pose. They're all data sets of like between 10 and 100,000 samples. He is working on data sets that are much, much bigger. Primate face basically extract facial expressions from monkeys using data, build a normative data set of all their faces for face analysis. Annotations, we want face bounding boxes, we want facial landsmarks, species, face ID, face action units. Like kind of, we're taking, just like ChatGPT, instead of taking one prompt, we're taking lots of different prompts. And in fact, we're getting like performance out of all of them. More than 1 million images, deep learning model family. As often you take the different kinds of things and you like just stitch them together into one really big model inference, and there you get the faces, and it works really, really impressively well across all different species. Now, I don't want to go into the details, but it even works really well on humans. And then he's working on special things for a colony of monkeys. Can we automatically identify all the neurons within that colony? And he's building data sets for that. He has data sets where you have one monkey in an enclosure, lip smacking, high resolution, open field social interactions, like all those things. And again, like you always benefit by combining all these things together. So I think what we will need to do in movement science is we have like good data sets of human movements, ideally annotated with a lot of additional information and combine it all together, high quality and so forth. So why foundation models? I wanted to zoom out a little into the logic of that. Who knows which Sutton's the bitter lesson? Okay, no one. Wonderful. So this is the most important insight in deep learning that we've seen that drives everything that is happening. It's a one-page essay by Rich Sutton, who's one of the pioneers of reinforcement learning. What Rich Sutton observed is the following. Regardless of what happens in human activity in machine learning, it starts out, we have a specific problem, like, what do I know? Like, I want to see where the hand is. And some clever person's like, okay, hand is hand colored. I remember as a PhD student 20 years ago, I was like building hand detectors. And hand has like a certain color. I know like it wouldn't have worked on all human beings, but like you build in clever ideas. Now hands are finite sized. Hands are like on human beings where other things might move to. Like you build in all those things. And by building these things, you get really good detectors, much better than what you had before. So it starts out with people doing data work by just thinking hard about things. And then time passes. We get more data. Like every domain of human endeavor gets exponentially more data. We get more data. Computers get faster. Yep, NVIDIA is now one of the biggest companies. I believe they just passed $2 trillion valuation. So compute comes along, data comes along. And then all the clever things that as human machine learning, human people built into it, become outmoded by general purpose compute. So ultimately, what you have in modern foundation models, take modern foundation models. People are like, yeah, there's so much about text that they have built, and they have nothing about text building. Like the modern transformer architectures, they're just a good way of like letting everything interact with everything else. It's really like just a very simple algorithm. So general purpose compute with massive data always outperforms humans. Why is that? well, it turns out that humans are only kind of right. Like my hand having a certain color, yeah, that would work with most people in this room, but not with all people in this room. No, and the stuff that like hands are like attached to a human body would most of the time work, but now it doesn't. And so like all these clever things that we build in, they're just like heuristics. They're kind of mostly right. No, like let's take speech. Lots of people build models for speech, and yeah, they're kind of right. They're kind of useful. And they did like human hearing modeling and so forth for that. But it turns out that there exists information that people cannot hear based on the retina that we have that is still just so marginally useful to make better machine learning for speech. So coming from that, it's all the things that we do as machine learners, just like it's the progress, it's the amount of data that we have, the amount of training that we have that ultimately comes like a steamroller towards all of us. So that means that a lot of things that we do in movement science will eventually be outmoded by just like enough data comes in. Like we can do all the predictions, all the decoding out of that. And therefore, like because of the bitter lesson, kind of like the big models will always outperform the small models. So there's a curse in small models, namely that there's a lot of things that they just can't do. And what do we get out of foundation models? Like foundation models give you embeddings. That means a mapping of the input data, a video that I take of you, into some space where the relevant data is there. All the rest is kind of mostly gotten rid of. And because you can expose the relevant things, all downstream learning problems are much easier. So embeddings are super easy. It leads to a situation where tasks are easily learnable, and it gives you good predictions of behavior. Now, what we don't know in that space yet is how to do science with them. Like with these models, they're like great at prediction. They're really good if you want to diagnose diseases. There's no doubt that they will outperform like anything we do very quickly. But how to ask questions about like how reality works with it, I think we're very unclear about that. And this is still going to be the wonderful thing in the next few years. Take home message. I think as a field, we're breaking out of the lab on a massive scale. And I think like the fact that we can do single camera, high quality post tracking just makes all kinds of things that we were mostly philosophizing about very quantifiable. And I think that there's like going to be so much cool stuff happening. And I think therefore the field will be very different. And out of that also comes that the skill sets will be different. Like almost everyone working on movement will need to use advanced data analysis methods. Generating data becomes much cheaper while like making sense of data gets to be much more complicated. And I think we'll be having all that transitions. And we hopefully will be able to say meaningful data, like computational motor control things about real world behavior. And hopefully we'll generate lots of skills and have fun on the way. Thanks so much. We have time for questions.
Thanks, Konrad. As someone who still likes studying 8-centimeter reaches, so I'm of the mindset that reaching in the lab is not very different than reaching in the real world. And it seems like your baseball study and a handful of other studies that are coming out, where people are doing online experiments and whatnot, it's essentially validating the theories and the ideas that were gained from the in-lab experiments. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So simple compared to baseball, but it's still a functional movement.
Yeah, so there's no doubt that the big things that we found so far in the lab, that they matter in the outside world. I'd argue they're a small part of the outside world. You can say it's true. In the outside world, I do estimate the distance of things. And the distance of things are arguably drawn from some very meaningful distributions. So I'm not saying that the things that we can discover with 8-centimeter movements, in fact, like the joke here is like 8 centimeters is the distance, and everyone agrees that it's going to be 8 centimeters and maybe 10 if you're like ambitious. So the things that we discover with that, they're real, no? And they will generalize into the outside world. And I'm with you, like that they will. It's just the question is how much of the variance of the outside world does it carry? And you can say the 10 centimeter move comes as part of like whole big movements in a big space. And these big instantaneous movements, like not only do we study 8 centimeter movements, but they also take 300 milliseconds. And these 300 milliseconds are part of like big sequences of us making tea or something like that. And therefore, like their scope is limited. Like, I'm not saying like, no, like all the things that we're finding out, they're real, they will generalize. They're reasonably future-proof. No, like I can totally imagine that my book will still be used in classes a few years down the line. But there are a lot of other things that we're just fundamentally missing. Like, what about strategies? No, like let's say we talk about teams. What about like motivation? What about community? Like, I think community is very important for the way people move, but also for the way people do anything else. And I think part of the reason why maybe the baby project isn't working so well in this way is because we cut out the movement, the interaction. Like the fact that like a baby will follow me when I do this, it's just all gone in the data set. And so we might have to like build that back in. So, but what I mean with that is kind of like the things that we can do in the lab, they're real, they're part of what happens outside, but they're probably, in my view, a small part of that. No, like let's take there's a lot of wonderful studies on like stabilization of like while you stand. But well, I'm a salsa dancer. And like the fact that we do salsa dancing like changes that. And like the whole mechanism will be different. And all of a sudden you have two people. And so the problem, as I see it, is at some level that we've been constrained to looking only at the part of movement that we can replicate in the lab. And there you can say, well, what if we make it big, like from 8 centimeters to whole bodies? Well, we will need to add things. And it's very hard to add things because the space in big spaces, there's just so many things you can do. Like if you just look at small movements, they're like, oh, there's just like everything becomes linear if you make it small. But like, of course, as soon as you make movements in big spaces, things become more complicated. And that means that at some level, to really be world relevant, I think we cannot ignore these pieces. But like your point is well taken. Like if I said that, like, if I said or implied that the things that we can learn with traditional movement science aren't meaningful about the world, I don't mean that. Like, and if I said it, I take it back. I don't mean it, and I'm wrong about it. But it's rather that I think it opens up all these additional dimensions. And you need big data for these additional dimensions. So like, as long as you're small, everything is linear and like it gets to be easily describable. But you can say as soon as you like open movements, the space in which they unfold is just so much larger. And if you want to describe a function on a much larger space, you will need far more parameters for that. And for that, you will need more data. Now, like, but you know, like my traditional experiments, 8 centimeters each direction, those experiments took like a few hours to like get very significant data. In fact, it's wonderful how movement psychophysics gives you the same data every time. It's very nice. But in when it comes to whole body movements, there's no doubt you will need much more, unless you study something very stereotyped. You know, like sure, like deadlifting probably lives in a very low dimensional manifold, but a lot of real world movements don't. But great point.
Video cameras for 25 years, and I remember when I did a PhD in Germany 20 years ago, Volkswagen was hiring vision scientists to build heat sensors. But still, it seems like it hasn't gotten off the ground either.
Yeah, it's a big mystery to me. So it seemed for a while that eye movements were a low-hanging fruit. Now, the slight problem with the eye movements is that at least until relatively recently, you couldn't solve the machine learning problem really well. Now, like the eye movement for people who maybe don't come from that area, the way the algorithms usually work, you basically find out where the eye is, and then you kind of like look at like a reflection of something or like where the black is of my eye relative to the rest. You need to find this first. And so a lot of older eye tracking systems kind of work, and like you need to first calibrate it so it's there. And that makes things difficult. But like you're right, like no, with machine learning, like finding an eye is like the easiest task you can possibly imagine. And modern like webcams have like so many pixels that like you'll be fine with for eye tracking. There exist eye tracking packages, as far as I know, that like work on video that are like pretty good now. I don't understand why there's not much of a community around it yet. And oftentimes, like uptake of those things require like high quality, reliable things. Then there's a problem with academia. Now, like in academia, it's very no, like there would be so many people who could do great research if you basically had like a simple software. You'd just say like, give me eye tracking, and it like automatically calibrates and it does like everything like really easily. But as academics, there's few people are like incentivized to provide such a product. So that might be part of them. But there should be parts of industry that are interested in that. But yeah, wonderful question. I don't understand why that's not happening. But that would be a great direction for more research. Yes.
I have a question. What you said about wonderful copywriting. I guess especially for the with things like ChatGPT, you kind of have a similar language to represent different domains of information. As if you draw these connections to different domains that typically exist. But movement science has multiple languages. You have things, have video, and then you add in things like sensor data and plastic data, all these different things that I guess my question is, how do you see a foundation model being built for this when like unifying all of these different
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think that movement science always has one thing in common, which is the human body. And the human body can kind of be described as like the skeleton and the face. I mean, like you get a lot of it out of those two. For me, force plate is just an expression of the human body. So you can say, for me, force plate data is more like translation to what in a German or something. And you can say, no, and we have neural data, and you can say that's translation into like a very far away language. And you can say there are other human beings and interactions with them. Well, then that's like a pairwise, like one body and another body. So I do think that there's like a common thing that's there, but I'm with you that a lot of data modalities will only reveal small parts. Like say, if I only have your wristwatch, do I know where the rest of your body is? Well, like in theory, no. In practice, like a lot of it, I will know, because if I find out from your wristwatch, yeah, that person is eating, well, probably you're sitting in front of a table and like the other hand is like nicely on the table, and like I can like predict probably a lot of it. But it's right, no, like the challenges are that tokenizing text is like very obvious. Now, like the way you want to tokenize text is kind of like every word, like you give it a token, and like smaller things for like for special for words that are like very heavy tailed or something. And you can say that tokenization of bodies is like a really interesting question. Like, what's a good way of like converting moving bodies into like discrete labels? That being said, like, I think if my body is in a certain configuration, most other people's bodies could probably be in that same configuration. So there, it feels like there is a bit of a common language. But it's right now that there's the question, like on video, I can maybe tell you your whole body configuration, but not quite, because the lower part of my body is now hidden and you can't directly see that. And if you have the wristwatch, you like really only know about the part of the body. And then the question is like, how can you tokenize in a way that allows you these models to meaningfully reason about it? And I think this is the big, interesting intellectual question in the construction of foundation models for movement. Big fan of your work, and I'm just wondering about your models take into account Yeah, I hear two aspects of your question. The first one is, does Konrad take it into account? And the answer is no. And I mean, like we do a little bit, we do things like, is there like a ball interaction? Do you learn about the pitcher while running multiple iterations with this? Like, no, it's a repeated game that you have. And like we looked a little bit at that, but by and large, no, like we don't have full context. I think the second part of the question, at least as I heard it, is, do I think we should be building in context? And the answer is like absolutely yes. No, like the interpretation of a body in an interaction situation makes preciously little sense without the others. No, like if I was in an empty room here talking like that, that would be really worrying. And whereas like you can say, if you want to describe me, it's like at least you should exist as context to describe my body, because without like that knowledge, like it makes no sense what I'm doing right now. And so I do think that to get good models, say you build foundation models of human movement, you do need to tokenize all the relevant pieces that define interactions in the world. And so, for example, for babies, we should like totally take every other person in the room and kind of provide like a descriptor of that. And because then then models can describe how maybe a baby would relate to an outside world.
Well, thank you very much.